Order. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. I'm Florence Eshalomi. I'm the chair of the Select Committee. Can I ask my committee colleagues to introduce themselves, please?
Lewis Cockin, the MP for Broxbourne.
Lee Dillon, MP for Newbury. Morning.
Will Forster, MP for Woking.
Sarah Smith, MP for Hyndburn.
Chris Curtis, Labour MP for Milton Keynes North, and my constituency is one of the sites on the recommended in the report.
Morning, Andrew Lewin, MP for Welland Hatfield.
Sean Woodcock, MP for Banbury, and part of the Hayford site is in my constituency as well.
Mayor Ellis, the MP for Ribble Valley.
Andrew Cooper, MP for Mid Cheshire.
Could I ask our guests to introduce themselves, please?
So Michael Lyons, I was chair of the New Towns Taskforce.
Cathy Pennycook, I'm the MP for Greenwich and Woolwich and the Minister of State for Housing and Planning.
Cathy Francis, I'm the Director for New Towns Housing Delivery and Infrastructure at the Department.
Thank you for joining us this morning. This morning we're going to be looking at the New Towns Task Force, which, following the general election in July 2024, the government announced that they were setting up a new task force, and it was chaired by Sir Michael, and that task force has now concluded and the government have received the recommendations. So we're just here this morning to delve in a bit deeper into those recommendations. Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, Sir Michael, and thank you for all of the work that you did in producing the really important report. And as someone who grew up in a new town, I think it's really good that the government has taken on this agenda. Do you want to start off by giving us a brief overview of the report, perhaps something that you think is most important in there and something you wish that during the process you'd spent a little more time doing or thinking about?
Well, perhaps I can separate those two challenges and say something about what we did do and then come back to whether or not that left any gaps. Firstly, let me acknowledge a very strong remit from government, very clear and strong remit. We were to, in a period of just 1 year, to come back with explicit recommendations about locations in which could be the site of a new generation of new towns. We were to focus initially on economic growth and look to areas where current housing issues in terms of both availability and price appear to be inhibiting economic growth. So that was very much the primary issue. But housing supply, a very important part of the agenda as well. So we would have come forward with sites, we would have come forward with recommendations on what these new towns might look like in terms of we interpreted that in terms of the principles for the development of those new towns, what you should require of them in the current age to be thriving places for people to live and invest in. And also to comment on how they might be achieved, particularly in terms of what sort of organisational arrangements you might make, the role of development corporations, but also the prospects for funding and the relationship between public and private funding. So all of that was part of the remit, very, very clear, as was the urgency. This ought to be carried forward, and a clear emphasis in the remit on looking for locations where work could begin quickly, given the pressing demands for housing, improved housing supply in this country. So I think that's the first point to make. Without spending too long on this, we did a considerable amount of desk-based research to identify areas of both existing growth and potential growth, as that was such an important part of the remit, to look at issues of where there was evidence of unsatisfied demand for homes, looked for detailed evidence of where companies felt they were constrained by an inability to recruit because of housing problems locally. All of that then provided the basis for going on to look in detail for the sites which we ended up recommending. I probably should stop at that point, really. Otherwise, I'll take the whole session just going back over
yes.
a year's very intensive
We've all
work.
read the report.
You've read the report, yes, of course.
Thank you very much. So, just moving on, Minister. Previous iterations of doing this exercise in recent decades have not ended up in as ambitious places the people who wrote those reports, like Sir Michael has, would have liked. primarily because once the report is done, the implementation has then just not worked. What are you doing, and why have you got confidence that this time things are going to be different?
Well, in developing the programme, we were inspired by the proud legacy of the post-war governments, the three waves of new towns that have come forward. But part of the Taskforce's excellent work was learning the lessons of those waves, what went right, what went wrong. So Michael can expand on this if you need, but some of that thinking, as I said, what went right and what lessons are to be learned is incorporated in the Taskforce report. I'm somewhat, and I think this is a general comment, Chair, somewhat constrained in what I can say at this point in time, because the government is, having received the Taskforce's final report, is scoping the programme in full, doing the necessary assessments. Some of that information is commercially sensitive, so that we can go out in the coming period to consult on both the SEA and adopted sites. So I can't give you much more detail than we are going through that very careful process of assessment, of scoping, of refining our objectives to ensure that the programme can deliver over the coming years.
But I think there's a really important machinery of government question, which I assume you can talk about, regardless of the specific sites. In order to actually implement these, and some of them are really quite ambitious programmes. So you talk about my site, you're effectively talking about the doubling of the size of quite a substantial city in this country. Quite a substantial project that it is going to involve a lot of, firstly, money, which we'll come on to in one way or another, national government directive, cross-departmental working. How are you setting up the teams within your department to ensure that they can meet that level of ambition?
So two things I'd say in response to that, and Cathy might want to add some comments. Firstly, really clear in the initial government response that this is a whole of government effort, that we require and we have secured cross-departmental buy-in to the objectives. We need every department to be prioritising what is necessary to bring forward the sites when we adopt them coming out of that process. And then separately, again, as is set out in quite some detail in the initial government response, we set up the New Towns unit, which is a joint work between the department and Homes England to go out and further scope the 12 sites recommended by the Taskforce.
Okay.
Can I add as well that during the Taskforce deliberations, one of the things that we were really heartened by was that available to Sir Michael and the Taskforce was any government department, any policy team that needed to input, for example, around the emerging industrial strategy. There have been officials that have spoken to the Taskforce from health, from education, from transport. And so once final decisions are taken on location and scope, I'm confident, and we have to do this because, as you say, it's a whole of government programme, that we will have the governance that is led by our New Towns unit in our department, but that reaches across Whitehall, but also extends to arm's length bodies. So the New Towns unit really has a remit that, yes, it's located within the department, but it is representing the wider machine, and we have named contacts in other government departments. I think all of that will help us reach into parts of departments that can help, because we know that this is going to be a significant effort.
So, I mean, do you think if you were to ask local councils or people from the development industry about their experience of the last few months of this first stage of the implementation progress, I realise you don't want to talk about the specifics, do you think that would be the experience that they've had of this bit of the process, is a government trying to pull things together?
Yeah, I would hope so. A lot of the visits that we've done have been with government departments, joint senior visits with Treasury, for example, always helpful. So I think we want to build on that. We haven't finalised the governance, but it's no point me going out as Housing Delivery Director. I recognise that I need my transport colleagues and other parts of the machine to join those discussions. So I would very much hope that those locations and other large sites that we're already working with will say that we're making every effort to bring government together. It's not perfect, and we have more to do to set out what that governance will look like from permanent secretary right through the ministerial team to working level. But I think we recognise that past efforts have often failed because the enthusiasm was located within a small number of, very interested people in a single department.
Yeah.
But we will fail unless we make this a whole of government effort, and we have the machinery to reflect that.
I mention it just because, having spoken to some people, they haven't quite felt that level of ambition come through in the implementation progress. There's one person from the private sector who apparently described it as like applying for a job when you don't know what the job is, whether there's a vacancy and what the salary will be. Local council leaders have said that in working with the department hasn't made it clear what delivery vehicles will be open to them. They've described it as seeming like a bidding process where they're against the other new town sites, which is exactly what this government wanted to get away from. And they feel like there's been a burden put on them, bearing in mind real tight finances in local councils at the moment when it comes to cuts we've seen in recent decades and potentially even more in some councils next year. They feel like the burden has been put on them when they're trying to find £10 million worth of cuts and don't know how they're going to be collecting the bins next year to come up with a delivery vehicle and funding mechanisms and set up development corporations.
It's not the case though.
But that's how often it's been. That's how they're being made to feel often by the department at the moment. So how can we get away from that culture to one that is far more ambitious? And
we haven't made decisions on delivery vehicles, so I'm surprised that places are feeling that burden is on them. As we move through the coming months to a final announcement, we'll be looking at the pros and cons of different delivery vehicles. We started having discussions, and I've been in some of those myself, with places, asking them what support do you need, what additional resource do you need in terms of finance to develop your teams if we are to move forward. So maybe there is more that we can do to be more public about that engagement and that offer, and we will solidify the offer. But I don't recognise that feedback, but I'm happy to follow up with you offline, because we certainly don't want this to be an additional burden that isn't recognised with our people and with financial resource.
Minister, we heard from Sir Michael about the urgency and how the direction that was given from the original piece of work, ensuring that work can begin quickly on all of these sites. Do we think that 3 sites with spades on the ground, whatever spades on the ground means, by the end of this Parliament meets that sense of urgency?
The wording is very clear that it's at least 3.
Okay.
And we hope to be able to take forward more if we're able to do so.
Thank you.
Can I just come in on Chris's questions there, Minister? So, this government has U-turned on winter fuel, it's U-turned on farmers, inheritance tax. So, it has. And so, I'm asking the Minister, not a member of the committee, Sean. So, what guarantee can you give those 12 sites that they actually will be delivered, given that obviously there are development options, there are land options on those, there are regional and local concerns about those. So whilst it's part of the ambition to deliver the housing that we need, you are going to face a lot of opposition, as I said, regionally and locally. And have you got the ability to carry those 12 towns forward?
I have to say, Mr. Dillon, I'm not particularly interested in the party politics. I can assure you and the committee...
It's about confidence in the
I
government.
can assure you and the committee we are going to deliver the New Towns programme. I just want to be really clear. The 12 sites are the sites recommended by the Taskforce. What the government is now doing is refining the scope of the programme, building our evidence base in discussion, engagement, collaboration with local areas. That's what the visits from officials, the offers to political leaders to come and meet, and others are about doing, building that evidence base, not going out and asking, can you do a delivery vehicle? Government will recommend the delivery vehicle, but we're building that evidence base. Mr. Kurtz, well, you could more than welcome to come back in once I've finished my answer. But we're building that evidence base, and we will then come forward in the coming weeks with an SEA report and a consultation on the sites we propose to adopt. Alongside that, they will be the sites that the government has chosen to adopt based on the Taskforce recommendations, but we're refining the evidence base to ensure that the sites we propose are the ones we will take forward. Yeah.
No decisions on sites will be made until the SEA reports are concluded.
That is in black and white in the government's initial response to the Taskforce.
And so once you've done that piece of work, Minister, again, you may face strong local and regional opposition.
Yep.
And are you confident that you'll be able to deliver these new towns in light of that potential opposition?
Yes, because we have always made clear that in the final analysis we will make decisions on these sites in the national interest. But again, just to further refine the committee's understanding of what I'm doing, I'm going to make decisions as the Minister responsible for what sites we consult on as proposed sites to be adopted. I'm then going to listen to the feedback from the consultation to make final decisions on the sites later on in the spring.
So, Michael, you touched on it already, but I'm after a bit more detail about how those 12 were sort of chosen. Could you go into a little bit of detail? Like I said, you've touched on it a little bit, but could you sort of maybe go about what sort of data you used and some of the other sort of calculations?
Absolutely. So we started with, right from the very beginning, really, some early mapping of where there were, where one could identify pressures in terms of house price movement, where you could find, where there was clear evidence of growth and growth potential. That in turn led to quite a discussion amongst the task force about the limits of looking only at historic growth and not having an adequate window on where you could expect growth in the future and what that might lead to. And that sort of broadened our view of what we were looking for in terms of new town locations. So that was predominantly a desk-based exercise. But we were clear from the beginning that what we've been asked to do was to come up with specific locations, not just some maps showing broad areas. And that's where we went out with our call for evidence, asking those responsible for proposals which met the criteria of at least 10,000 homes in the first instance. We clearly hoped that they would be larger still. So our call for evidence was to local authorities, to developers, to landowners, to make us aware of proposals which we could further consider to present to government those specific locations. Out of that, we ended up with a total of somewhere around 120. 100 came in from the call for evidence. That was added to sites which Homes England or the department were already aware of and were already in discussions about. And then we began an exhaustive process of both exploring whether they met the criteria that we had established and exploring some of the issues which were key to our being able to recommend, issues like environmental conditions, where there were risks of floods or other problems, availability of current infrastructure. It's a pretty comprehensive list, really, of the questions that you would ask before recommending an area. Then finally, once we narrowed down to somewhere around 20 possible locations, we had detailed discussions with those proposing those areas, including visits by a subset of the task force, led by me personally, where we were testing the reliability of the information that we got, testing local feelings, but most of all exploring whether those proposing this location were really understood what would be demanded of them in terms of placemaking principles, engagement with government, timescale, rapid improvement in terms of projected growth and supply of housing. So there was quite an intense conversation around those subjects. Out of that, the whole task force took a decision on the 12 locations that we would recommend. Is that a fair enough summary? I'm happy to be probed on any part of that.
That's really helpful, thank you. And Minister, in terms of the three that ended up being the preferred or the most promising, I think is the term that's used. Can you go from those 12? How did you get to those three, and what sort of methodology criteria were sort of?
Well, it's a fair question. We set out the objectives for the task force in its terms of reference, and they were clear. And there were a number of those: creating environmentally resilient places, contributing to transforming the way that large settlements are delivered, providing housing for strong communities, etc. But the two primary high-level objectives that we set the task force, as Sir Michael has already commented on, were unlocking potential economic growth and productivity and accelerating housing delivery. And while we were very clear in our initial response that prima facie all 12 of the recommended locations met those objectives, the three most promising that we named seemed, out of all of them to us, on the basis of those criteria, to most closely adhere to those objectives in terms of being able to unlock economic growth and accelerate housing delivery, just as propositions, prima facie, in the terms that the Taskforce reported to us. But as I say, we are now doing the work to refine those propositions to test those assumptions.
And clearly there's a lot of stakeholders involved in it, and this, as Sir Michael has sort of talked about, the various groups involved in pitching sites. Are you confident about there's clearly going to be an agenda behind all of those, but that political interference that is minimum in terms of pushing a lot of that forward?
It's probably for Sir Michael to answer as to the engagement of promoters and interests, land interests and others in the Taskforce's work and its recommendation. We're engaging with local leaders, partners on all of these sites, as I said, to refine our evidence base, but no lobbying from any particular interest is going to influence which sites the government determines to adopt.
As far as the government is concerned, these 12 are, to any relatively neutral impartial observer, the best in terms of the criteria set out by Sir Michael.
In terms of, that was the remit we gave the task force to come up with on the basis of the objectives we set out in the terms of reference. What are the sites across the country that most adhere to those? As I say, we're now going through, and there's a slight nuance to the process, which is why I'm trying to explain to the committee exactly what we're doing. We're now refining the scope of the programme to take forward, testing the task force's assumptions. There's a world, I suppose, I put the counterfactual to you, in which government just designed the programme, didn't go out to an independent expert task force, but we have benefited hugely from the work of Sir Michael and all of the members of the task force. But as you can see from their credentials and the different skills they brought to that task force, there's a wealth of expertise there that informed government, and we can take forward in terms of refining the scope of the programme.
Lewis and then Andrew.
Yeah, I want to touch on a bit more on infrastructure, because I'm not sure you've answered the questions from my colleagues. So in my constituency of Broxholm, just over the border from Chase Park and Cruise Hill, Newtown, which is 22,000 homes, which is in the top 3, and it's really close to the village of Goffsoak, which has had too much development anyway. What impact assessments have you done on local roads, for example, the M25 and the A10? So what I'm trying to get at here is, how did you pick these top 3 locations, and what assessment of current infrastructure and the challenges around that, so traffic, for example, on current roads have you done to recommend these 3 as the top 3?
I start off by saying that how they ended up in the top 12, and then leave the Minister to. So we did detailed examination of infrastructure constraints. We looked carefully at planned investment in infrastructure, but our judgment was really founded not on trying to find reasons to exclude a location, but to reveal what would need to be done to make that an effective location. And so the fact that it's ended up in the top 12 means that we were convinced that although there are infrastructure challenges across most of the most interesting locations that we were given to consider, what we came forward for consideration, but our focus was on trying to be clear that we could understand that actually what was needed, and that it was reasonable to imagine that those needs would be met over the life of a new town, 20, 30 years, not all having to be satisfied at day one.
But so the M25 and the A10 is gridlock at rush hour. You want to put 22,000 homes right next door to that, and you're not saying you can only do that if you put this infrastructure in first. You've said you've done an assessment and everything seems okay. That's what I've just picked up from your answer.
Can I just come? There's one point in that question which I do just need to pick up, and it's very clear in our report. We have emphasised that a new generation of new towns absolutely must give a priority to public transport solutions. It simply cannot be the car-borne examples that you find on many recent larger developments, partly because of the pressures on the on existing road networks, but partly because actually of the environmental cost and the health costs of continued growth in car-borne transport. So our model is very much one that is less dependent on car-borne travel than previous new towns. That is one of the distinctions of the placemaking principles that we put forward. I don't mean to suggest for a moment that there will not be car journeys that are generated by a new town and additional population. Just that for us, the issue of how that is managed downwards is a very important point.
If you think you're going to create a new town in a particularly rural setting and no one's going to use a car, I mean, you're just on a different planet. If you think everyone's going to... It's a bit like turning up to a transport meeting. The person comes in a car and says everyone's got to walk and cycle everywhere. It just doesn't happen in reality.
But this is a location that has a station, and it's possible to envisage the expansion of rail-based transport from that area, which would certainly mitigate the demands on the road network.
And again, it comes back to this is not the end of the process. We're involved in the process of building the evidence base and scoping. We will go out to consult on those adopted sites. There'll be the chance for people to input as part of that. And then in the final decision-making process, in the event of, for example, the delivery vehicle being chosen in that location or any other location being a development corporation, there'd be another consultation. So we will refine the propositions that we want to take forward. But on Cruise Hill in particular, it's the same with Leeds South Bank and Thamesford, the growth potential is as clear as day. In terms of an urban extension that will unlock economic growth and productivity in London and accelerate housing delivery, quibble about the amount, but London has a very stretching housing target that it needs to make. That is a very, very promising location. And so we'll build the evidence base and see whether it makes the final cut of adopted sites. And that will then come with a bit more detail to come when we made the final decisions, but what the funding implications are of that, the delivery vehicle, etc.
And just to add, sorry, Chair, can I?
Very quickly.
Yeah, just to add very quickly that, the locations chosen are a minimum of 10,000 homes and some significantly more. But, this will be the work of 10, 20, 30 years and across a long spending review period. So I think as we move forward with the next stage of the work, that will be one of the things we consider. The infrastructure needs into the future and how we phase them and how we plan for them as a government over the longer term. It won't be 20,000, in one parliament.
Thank you. Andrew C. and then Chris, very quickly, please.
Thank you. I'd just like to, Minister, I'd just like to come back to the answer that you gave to Sean a moment ago. I think you've said several times now that the task force has produced this list of 12 locations based on the criteria, doing a good job, but based on the criteria that you've given them, and that you're now refining the scope of that criteria. Do you expect then that refinement process is going to reduce the number of locations from 12 to a lower number, or do you expect the list of locations to change, to stay at 12 or to increase perhaps based on your refinement of the scope?
That is what we will go out to consult on when we made final decisions as to what proposed sites we are to adopt. I'm not going to preempt that consultation here at the committee, but part of the process, both the SEA process and the wider scoping of the programme, is to determine which sites that we propose be adopted and that therefore we go out to consult on before making final decisions.
So the 12 sites that are in there now, they're not. That might change. There might be more. There might be less. We'll see.
I go back to the answer I gave to the chair earlier, and is set out in the initial government response. No final decisions on sites will be made until after that consultation process, and we've made those final decisions. At which point we'll have clarity on delivery vehicles, on funding, how we intend to take each site forward. But we are going through at the moment a really important process of further establishing the evidence base as government, separate from the task force, having had their recommendations, so that we can make those decisions.
Just on this question, coming back to what Sir Michael said on urgency and work to begin quickly, it was just over a year to produce the report. We've now got the SEA process. You've then said there'll be a consultation on that process that might recommend delivery vehicles. There will then be another consultation on whether the delivery vehicle that's chosen is correct, and I assume there'll probably be at least 2 more consultations beyond that before any work can actually get started on doing it. Is that really meeting the sense of urgency? I think I've heard the term 3 years talk to set up a development corporation. So let's say we're towards the back end of next year before we've reached the consultation on the final decisions you've made. We're beyond the next election. Is there nothing that can be done to speed up and accelerate this process and not make it death by consultations, because that's the enemy of delivery?
We are going to do it properly and in a way that doesn't allow the programme to be challenged and undermined.
Some people would say that lots of consultations does not equal doing it properly.
But the commitment remains spades in the ground on at least 3 sites in this Parliament, hopefully more. But we're talking about, as Cathy said, we're talking about large-scale new communities, in many cases tens of thousands of new homes. This is not something we can rush out in 12 months. The average time to set up a development corporation, 12 to 24 months. We've looked to streamline some of the powers that development corporations can draw upon through the Planning and Infrastructure Act, and we'll give further consideration as to how we can expedite the timelines where appropriate. But we have got to go through the SEA process. We do want to allow a brief time to consult on that SEA and the proposed sites that we recommend adopting, and then we'll make final decisions in the spring, and we'll proceed from there.
And can I just add, in terms of post the spring, we won't be waiting if a development corporation is indeed the right vehicle. We won't be waiting until a DevCo is set up before anything is done. So I think once ministers have made decisions on the final locations, then we can start doing preparatory work, working with local leaders, working with local teams in local authorities and development partners to get those sites ready. So it's not as if nothing will happen if indeed a development corporation is the right vehicle until that is set up. I think you will see work begin in earnest, and all the necessary preliminary work before a site can be ready commence this year.
Michael, obviously, in the submission and the interim report, you received over 100 potential sites. That was narrowed down to 12. And the government have, said thank you for your recommendations. On those, we are thinking 3 would be quite good to accelerate and deliver. Would they have been your 3 top sites?
That's a slightly invidious question, really, isn't it,
The Taskforce 3 sites.
We weren't asked to prioritise these, so I don't have information on the views of the Taskforce because we simply did not seek to prioritise them.
Indeed, you're now free from the Taskforce. Would they have been your 3 sites?
Personally, I think they are 3 amongst. Look, I'm enthusiastic about all 12. Let me be clear about that. Nothing would give me greater pleasure than the government felt able to progress those.
Your favourite child.
And I'm very.
Who's your favourite committee member?
And I'm very pleased at the government's response, saying that it too wants to look at how many it can progress. But this is not a short-term game, and the report makes it clear that really it hopes that government will not only start on a number of new town locations, but actually get back to running a long-term programme of large-scale developments, including new towns.
Okay, thank you. Andrew L.
Thank you, Chair. I'm keen to come back on delivery and development vehicles. So look, take a step back. In the first generation of new towns, development corporations played an integral role in the 2 towns that I represent, Hatford and Welwyn Garden City. The development corporation set up in 1948, ran all the way to 1966. And one of the things I think we mustn't lose sight of is that in new towns we have a significantly higher than average proportion of social housing outside of the big cities. It's sort of the biggest anywhere in the country, and that is a testament of the ability to development corporations to buy land at good value and build those affordable and social homes. So look, I'm an advocate of the model. So Michael, in your report, you were pretty clear. The Taskforce recommends that the starting point for the delivery of all new towns is through the development corporation model. And Minister, in your interim response, the government was equally warm, but it wasn't sort of definitive, and it said you might explore alternatives. So my first question is, what alternatives are you exploring and why?
Well, again, this comes back to the process of refining the scope of the programme. We were very clear that we agree with the Taskforce's recommendation that development corporations are the primary vehicle by which to take forward these sites. But we do want to allow scope for other types of vehicle, from your simple joint venture, the many types of development corporation that are available, mayoral development corporations, centrally led, even locally led development corporations. So there are a range of delivery vehicles that potentially can be used. The decision as to which we are refining as part of what will work for each individual site. And where can we get the most benefits in terms of meeting our aims and objectives and what is required. In many cases that will be some type of development corporation, but there are in other cases where, particularly on sites, and so Michael might want to say about this, having a lot more insight into what's going on the ground from all the engagement that's taken place. But some of these sites are already building out in part, there's work going on, there's already interests involved in development. And it may be that it's quicker in some cases, to return to Mr. Curtis's point, to take things forward through another delivery vehicle. But we share the general preference for development corporations as the only vehicle proven really to successfully deliver communities at scale when they work well. And we've learned some lessons from development corporations that are up and running now across the country, but they are only really, really effective where they have a clear strategic vision, where they have the powers to facilitate land assembly, to plan, to bring forward that physical and social infrastructure, including affordable housing, and harness private investment. But we can get, as I think I've said to the committee on a previous occasion, in terms of what you can do, in particular in terms of land value capture, get much more public gain from the use of a development corporation to deliver things like affordable housing at the scale we want.
I think the Minister answered most of that question. Just let me add the perspective of the task force. And we were clear and spent a lot of time going over the history of new towns and indeed the challenges of the locations that we were looking at, and came down very firmly with the view that a development corporation of one form or another brought so many benefits that should be the right way to go forward. However, as you see in the report, we also acknowledge that actually the fact that we were looking at a number of sites where work had already begun, where land ownership was already established by people with an intent to carry it forward, was slightly different. You weren't buying existing farmland. In many cases, you were buying land. You would be considering the purchase of land which was already in the ownership of an organisation which had the intent to develop it, which makes it quite a different case, I think. It was interesting in those discussions because we challenged this in detail about what would be the reactions of those landowners and developers, those proposing the scheme, if the government insisted upon a development corporation as the way forward. And not one of them said that would be out of the question. A number of them had reservations, partly about based on what it would mean for them and the investment they'd already made. But what they were consistently looking to government for was a strength of purpose, ability to work across government departments, the help to both secure speedy planning permission and assemble land. All of those things we pointed to were more likely to be achieved if you had a development corporation here single-mindedly pursuing the development. And those arguments actually were very often won people over, at least as far as we got at that stage. I mean, clearly there's much more negotiation with landowners, developers and principals still to be completed, and that's what the Minister's referring to, I think.
Thank you both. Very comprehensive. Just to say, it might be one for outside the committee, but there are echoes in history here. So Welwyn Garden City, of course, was already in development before it became a new town. So this is not the first time we've had to deal with this problem. One more question, if I can, Chair, about political risk in the political cycle. Look, no parliament can be bound by its successor, but of course we do have recent history of big infrastructure projects, HS2 probably being the most obvious example of political wrangling, meaning that we reached inertia. I'm interested, particularly, Minister, in your view, how can you make significant progress in this Parliament so that should there be a new government in 2029, that this is a programme that looks to, across the political spectrum, one that is in everybody's interest to continue?
And I think the sort of precise, I'm looking for the correct form of wording, I think the precise political dynamics will partly depend on the delivery vehicle.
Yeah.
if the deliveries vehicle is a mayoral development corporation, the mayor in question will have ownership of that delivery vehicle. I suppose there is a sort of probably more acute risk to centrally led development corporations in terms of the government. But one of the factors, and it comes back to both a sort of factor we asked the task force to look at, but that we're considering as we refine our objectives, is deliverability. There's a deliverability question from the point of view of what is the required infrastructure, the offer from government, if you like. There's a sort of temporal deliverability aspect, which is, and again, that played a part in the choice of those 3 most promising sites. What are the ones that we can start going on sooner than others? And they're quite clearly amongst the 12R ones that present much more of an opportunity in that regard. But I come back to what I said to Mr. Curtis. We want spades in the ground on at least 3 of these in this Parliament with work underway. At that point, I don't think it's a brave government that junks a delivery vehicle that's up and running, where we have been put in place the necessary planning powers, vehicle, as we said, just on development corporations to facilitate master planning, land assembly, that junks all of that, I would say.
Thank you. Just mindful of time, colleagues. Will.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, the new towns delivery bodies are likely to require significant upfront funding, but there was nothing in the budget, nothing. Can you explain why, and when will the government announce funding, and particularly in relation to the 3 priority new towns, do you have an estimate of how much funding they will need to get up and running?
I think it's so. I understand why, but it's not accurate to say that there's no funding available to government for new towns. There isn't a new towns funding pot, but the new towns programme will be delivered with a combination of our existing grant funding pots, so the 39 billion social and affordable housing programme, the National Housing Delivery Fund we've got, circa £5 billion for land and infrastructure grant funding, the National Housing Bank with the circa £16 billion of financial capacity that sits behind that. So we will draw on all of these sources to bring forward the programme. In terms of what clarity the committee can expect and the House can expect going forward, I think in very general terms at the point we console, we'll be able to say a bit more about funding in terms of the broad categories of funds that might be used to deliver. So for example, if we propose an adopted site and the recommended delivery vehicle is a centrally led development corporation, there'll be a sense of what the government offer is on that. But funding details will have to wait till we've made those final decisions, only later in the spring, and then we'll have a clear set of sites that we propose to take forward and how we propose to take them forward. But there is funding there to draw on.
Thank you. So Michael, your report highlighted that actually confidence from the marketplace is so important. Is at the moment that lack of funding or uncertainty of funding a concern, but if the Minister is going to announce something towards the end of this year, if that funding is, I assume you believe that funding has to be good enough, or we won't build these new towns, the industry won't have confidence in them?
Well, the Task Force is very clear on the importance of forward funding from government and of government being able to strike a deal with landowners and developers in each location that they could look forward to a return on their investment. So that was a very important part of our conclusions. The timing of people's expectations is quite difficult to know, really. I think realistically, those involved as landowners, developers, understand from their own experience how long it takes to meet statutory regulations, and for government to come forward with very specific conclusions on funding. So I doubt that obviously people would like a decision sooner rather than later. That is particularly, I think, significant in those locations where development is already underway, but people are realistic. Particularly developers understand the challenges that the government is actually faced with at the moment before it can be more specific.
Just for clarity, Minister, so obviously you're going to have the SEA, you'll have the additional consultation. Just in terms of the upfront funding which the task force recommended to get the delivery models up and running. That funding has been earmarked and been put aside, essentially.
I'll bring Cathy in, might add a bit more detail from an official point of view, but no, the precise funding offer will be made clear at the point that we make final decisions on the programme and make that public. Part of what we're doing through both the SEA but the wider scoping of the programme is to determine what are the precise objectives, and we'll consult on those as part of they'll be part of the consultation process. What are the sites we want to take forward and how? So we're refining, if you like, all of the questions about how we deliver these sites as part of that process, and that will include the funding. So I don't have a set of funding pots in my head for various sites. We're working that out, and that will be part of the decision we take that we consult on before final decision.
If I can just add a little on what's happening now. So Sir Michael started the engagement with local areas. We have continued that, speaking to developers, local authorities, in terms of making recommendations to ministers, which, as I said up front, will be ministers in this department, but also more broadly. We will need to set out what we think the costs will be in this Parliament and give some sense of longer-term costs, but we need to be quite specific on nearer-term costs, including on the setup of any delivery vehicle or any interim arrangements. And we have funds that we can draw on. I think what we're saying is the funding...
Those funds that you can draw on, my understanding is that they will come from existing programmes, including the Social Affordable Housing Programme, grants from the National Delivery Bank and the National Housing Bank. That's correct.
Yeah, that is correct. But there will also be, as we look at infrastructure, a call from other departments. But the initial funding for the setup of the delivery vehicle, we recognise that we need capacity to help local authorities bring forward these sites, and we will, as part of our recommendations to ministers, make clear what we think is needed in this Parliament, and those funds will be prioritised from our budgets.
Right, those three pots are capital spend, right? But what you also need here, in order to set these, is probably quite substantial if you do it, a significant day-to-day spend. So that's not going to come from the 39 billion or the 16 billion from the Housing Bank. So where's that money going to come from? And how much is there? Because you must have, you can only, I see you can't make the offers yet, you haven't made decisions yet, you can only offer what you've got. So you must have an idea in your head of how much there is in that section and how much potential there is money-wise, which I assume you can broadly have a number on that you can share with us.
The department is going through a process of business planning, post-spending review, and how much RDEL can be allocated to different priorities, of which this is one. So we have a sense, although we've some final decisions to make on the exact funding pots, but we have a sense of the amount of RDEL funding. But you're absolutely right that it requires RDEL as well as CDAL to deliver.
Yeah, the resource costs will come from RDEL, and we are working through that, and we will be able to publish that in due course.
And that's
it goes
where I
back
suppose
to the initial question from my colleague in terms of our disappointment, maybe in terms of the autumn statement being quite quiet on the funding for this. I think it's a case of, if you're reassuring us, Minister, that those discussions with Treasury colleagues are happening, so that once you get a better idea of how much you will need, will you then, do you feel that you'll be confident enough to come back to the committee at a later stage to say, well, this is what maybe you secured to get the initial corporations up and running, or there's going to be some new funding rounds, or will you be going out to private funding? Is this where you're keeping options open for land, joint ventures, other models? It's just trying to get a bit more clarity on.
We have funding within the department that ministers have been clear that as part of our business planning, we will prioritise what is needed for new towns to make sure that they can come forward. So it won't be a case of going back to Treasury, because we have our funding envelope for this spending review. It will be about prioritising both RDEL and capital costs in this spending review, and having a longer term view of what is needed when we announce which sites will come forward. They won't come forward unless we are confident that we can do what is necessary, provide the support with Ardell and with capital costs from our existing budget. So just to be clear, we're not going back to Treasury. It's ministers have given us a clear steer that we must prioritise our resourcing for new towns as we
current
finesse.
envelope.
Yes.
Okay.
Chair, could I just add a footnote from the research that the Taskforce did? Because Taskforce's report is very clear about the importance of confident funding from government. But what we found was that one needs to take care of this issue of earmarking funds. And Ebbsfleet gave us a very clear example that in the early days, the estimates of how quickly they would be able to get going were quite wide of the mark. And as a result of that, they had round their neck to some disadvantage in their early days. The problem of being seen to underspend, to have failed to have used the budget when it could have been used for other purposes. So this issue of precision in when the money is becoming available and care not to earmark if actually you can be confident of programme funding, I think is a very important part of the mix.
And I agree on that. I think it's not about precision, it's about clarity on the funding. So I think we were just trying to seek that.
Hopefully you've got that now within the spending envelope from existing sources. But to reassure the committee, it's not the case that, just to follow up again on Mr Forster's question, that because the Chancellor did not announce a new towns funding pot at the budget, that there isn't money in the department to take forward the programme. But I think, and this is Mr Curtis chomping at the bit to come in again, but I think
a vague number would be, do you know what I mean? Like just a sense of scale.
There's no way I can give you a vague number.
It could be like there's 10p somewhere sitting somewhere, or there could be tens of millions of pounds or billions of pounds.
The committee and the House will have clarity on funding when we have made final decisions in the spring. I've given you a sense of the funding pots that are available that we're prioritising from. I think what may be useful for me to say just in addition to that, which I think was somewhat the thrust of your question, of course government has to cut its cloth in terms of what can be delivered in this Parliament. So I give the sort of, I suppose, hypothetical. If through the SEA and scoping of the programme, we thought that X number of sites were best taken forward by centrally led development corporations in every instance, could government stand up, scores of them? Quite clearly not. We will have to make decisions about what sites should be in the programme and at what point we can bring those forward.
Yeah. Okay. Andrew.
I'm more than happy to come back. It goes without saying, Chair.
That would be helpful, Minister. Thank you. Andrew.
Thank you, Chair, Minister. I think you'll recognise that a fundamental frustration of our constituents is that far too often when they accept housing development in their towns and their communities, that the infrastructure appears years later, if ever, and that is fundamental to the Section 106 process as it stands at the moment. And the whole point, I guess, of the new towns delivery model is that we avoid that the infrastructure is part of a planned community. But by having announced the sites, we are now at risk potentially of speculative development in these locations that would need to be dealt with. I think there's also a risk that we've increased the value of these sites potentially, which may make it more expensive to deliver. So what steps has the government taken, what steps have you taken to capture the land value early and to protect these sites from speculative development before you're ready to take them forward?
Yep. Again, for further detail, I refer you to the initial government response. We're very clear about the approach there we're taking in respect of land, and that we're going to, as a government, support delivery bodies for new towns to acquire land, and that the no-scheme principle of compensation for compulsory purchase would apply. i.e., if we need to use compulsory purchase powers, compensation will not include land value generated by the new town scheme. So we have put the necessary safeguards into place. Again, we're refining the approach to land in different localities. Again, drawing off, and Sir Michael, Cathy might want to come in, but Sir Michael may want to expand on the Taskforce's recommendations in terms of land. But this was a central consideration, how at the point we've evidenced, or even through the call for evidence, that sites are known to be being explored as new town propositions. How do we ensure that we don't see precisely that?
Not much to add, really. I mean, we were very clear about the need to protect government investment and the prospects for return. We looked carefully at land value capture and reached the conclusion that whilst it was possible, it absolutely depended upon having control and ownership of land, and that one should not be too optimistic about what costs could be covered through land value capture. So I think here we would strongly endorse the approach that the Minister's outlining today.
You're satisfied by the government's response to this? Okay. Is there anything else that you think that the government should be doing to capture value and to safeguard potential sites?
In a perfect world where there were no constraints on expenditure, you'd be out now buying as much land as possible, negotiating very hard. I consistently, in conversation with the Minister, underlined the importance of quite muscular negotiation with landowners. I think what landowners and developers want from government, they see as very valuable.
What do you mean by muscular negotiation? Can you just
let me just outline what I think that landowners are looking for. They're interested in a strong partnership with government because they see that as the way to speeding up planning approval, dealing with infrastructure issues, securing good quality forward planning. If government brings those strengths through a development corporation or some other mechanism, it has a right to expect that its investment secures a return. And therefore, right from the beginning, I think it needs to be clear that approval of a new of a location being part of a new town programme does have value, and that the additional speed that's involved can secure an earlier return on capital for owners and developers. And I think basically we're saying that's something the government needs to bear in mind in its discussions and seek to be as strong as it can be in securing its position for the future.
Okay. How critical is it to the success of the scheme, would you say, that the land value is captured effectively? I think in your answer you appeared to be saying that the land value capture is important, but it's not the be all and end all. Would you stand by that? Am I putting words in your mouth?
No, I mean something slightly different.
Okay.
Where we got to on this, after spending a lot of time on it, was a recognition that in popular discussion, land value capture was often seen as likely to meet a much higher proportion of costs than it will in practice. We were clear, the Taskforce was clear, that government should take steps to protect the possibility of land value capture to minimise the cost on the public purse. But new towns will not be fully funded through land value capture in any reasonable scenario about future values. And so there will be costs for new towns which are part of the creation of new settlements and of funding economic growth, and need to be accepted as part of that reasoning rather than a return on the investment made.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do you still want to come in, Lou?
On question 7, I am.
Okay.
No, I covered mine off on Chris's earlier.
Thank you, Chair. So Michael, in your report, it was really clear the importance you placed on placemaking in these new towns. But would you agree that there's an inherent tension between having really ambitious house building targets and the aspirations for the high quality aspect of these new settlements you want to see built?
Well, there may be a trade-off, so I don't want to sound naive about this. However, what we saw as we moved around the country, as we talked to house builders, developers, housing associations, was that there were plenty of examples of people meeting rather similar requirements to those that we were demanding, and feeling that they had got a return on their investment. So it's not completely ruled out, I think is the answer. Clearly, there has to be a discussion about how these placemaking principles are applied to any one location I think I've subsequently gone on record as saying that in 30 years' time, the really successful new towns will be those that score highly on all of them. It is not a pick and mix agenda, but they will apply differentially in terms of local circumstances and what's going on in surrounding areas. We spend a lot of time on these, and I think they are a comprehensive set of challenges for ending up with a new town which is both attractive to residents and to investors, and the two things need to go hand in hand.
Can I just come in on quality, if that's okay? But just on quality of housing, it's just to pick up something I raised in the Chamber yesterday, so the Minister will be aware. But is the government committed to mandating a new homes ombudsman in this Parliament at all, to secure the quality of new builds going forward?
Putting it on a statutory footing?
Yeah.
I'm happy to write to you and set out the details. The new home ombudsman is obviously in place, making a vital contribution.
Yeah.
There's more I think we could explore on redress. I think I committed to you yesterday, in fact, but I will.
The Secretary of State said to follow up in a meeting.
I will certainly do that. I'm more than happy to meet to set out what the government is doing in that particular area. On quality, just in general terms, the government absolutely supports the placemaking approach recommended by the Taskforce. We were very clear from the outset. I think the first written ministerial statement and the manifesto that we stood on. We want these to be exemplary developments. There is a question as to how those placemaking principles are taken forward on any particular site. And again, and I'm sorry to have to keep coming back to it, but the final selection of placemaking principles for the government will be subject to environmental assessment and consultation. But the committee won't have to wait for long to see what we mean by the detail of that.
And Minister, I saw you shaking your head when I suggested that perhaps those two things were in tension. I
don't think there's an inherent I don't think there is necessarily an inherent trade-off, particularly not in terms of some of the delivery vehicles we're looking at. There's a tension, but I don't think there has to necessarily be a trade-off between supply and high-quality design.
But getting this right is absolutely key to building the trust of the communities where these places will be. And unfortunately, we could probably go around every single member on this committee who would have an example of where a smaller development hasn't delivered on that, that the commitment to social infrastructure wasn't there. And certainly there's research out there that provides the kind of the backing for that as well. So how have the lessons of maybe bigger examples where that's been failed and people have been failed, how have those lessons been learned in terms of how you're going to take these plans forward and how you're going to ensure those principles are delivered through these developments and we don't have communities moving in with no schools or hospitals or the station capacity not being there for them, because that will completely lose the trust of the electorate fundamentally.
You're quite right. Of course, partly it's those problems which have led both the Taskforce and government to focus on larger scale developments. Larger scale developments, 10,000 plus, much easier to secure long-term planning, to plan infrastructure more effectively, so that it actually coincides with development rather than lags it. So that was a very clear finding of ours, which I think the government has taken on. And indeed, I think the legacy of the New Towns Taskforce work is as much about all large-scale developments, following on from the evidence of the Competition and Markets Authority pointing to larger-scale developments, and the virtual absence of them in recent years. This is the way to go forward, but it has its challenges.
Minister, do you also want to respond?
I could expand on that in two ways, I think. Firstly, I obviously recognise, not least from my own constituency, that yes, development often comes forward and has over recent years that is not good, that is not high quality, and that we need to drive up standards. Generally, is why in our manifesto we said we want exemplary development to be the norm, not the exception. There's great examples out there, but it is broadly the exception at the moment. We're taking that forward in a number of ways, both in the MPPF in December 2024, but in the current MPPF draft that's out for consultation. We've strengthened the expectations in terms of national policy around infrastructure delivery. and particularly modern infrastructure of the kind you cited. We are bringing forward, in conjunction with that MPBF, a new suite of design guidance to try and drive up standards on these new town locations in particular. And this is why, again, as part of the scoping of the programme that we're taking forward currently, we've got to differentiate, we've got to sort of make clear, how these are differentiated generally, although we can learn lessons from just general large sites, of which, again, the MPPF out for consultation has policy in relation to. But I come back to, and it goes back to Mr. Cooper's questions and others, we will be able to extract more public gain because of the way these are delivered, and therefore have much more confidence that we can ensure that the social, physical infrastructure and amenities and services are in place at the point that we need them to be. But you are absolutely right. We will be judged, and I think communities, the extent to which communities will accept these new large-scale developments will heavily rest on whether they are those exemplary places that people want to live. They cannot just be bog standard housing estates. That would represent a failure of the programme, in my view.
Thank you. And just also to now just focus specifically on the environmental sustainability requirements that have been outlined by the Taskforce. If the new towns are to be these exemplar developments, should they be required to meet higher environmental standards than what might currently be the norm? And I'm happy for that to be the Minister.
Do you mind if I just take the liberty of going back to the last question then to come to this? Because a point I would just like to share with the committee was the pleasure that I took as we went round talking to landowners and developers was to find evidence amongst a number of the sites that we've actually recommended to government of developers themselves wanting to develop to the very highest standards. Because they saw that as a market advantage. They saw in the long term that would secure a better return on their investment. That's clearly not the case for every development in the country, but that gave me considerable heart that this is not a process that solely requires government to make demands. It's actually understood in the market. Now, if I can come back to your point, just remind me, please.
Just on the specifics you outlined around the environmental standards within these new towns, do you believe that given the exemplar nature of what we want these developments to be, there needs to be higher environmental standards than currently?
These are all of the new towns are long-term projects. It's something that we've come back to time and time again here. Resilience to the climate changes over the long term, really important part of the planning. And again, it takes you back to really effective large area planning for large settlements, makes that more possible than piecemeal development around existing settlements. So I think there is a sort of discipline in the whole process of determining new towns, which focuses you more on the future, more on resilience. Whether that needs different regulations or requirements, I think we have to see as those sites come forward.
Just to add, I suppose, from a more general national planning policy perspective, through the draft MPBF that's out to consultation, one of the things we're specifically trying to do is ensure that where there are appropriate national standards in place, for example, the forthcoming future homes and regulation standards, that local areas aren't developing their own divergent policies. We want to be very clear that where there is a national policy in place, that can stand, and that duplication or deviation is not particularly helpful in that regard. So on things like that, wouldn't be expecting homes in the new towns to go beyond. We want to generally pull up standards across the board in a variety of areas.
Can I add one point on that? That through the discussions that we've been having with local areas, and we'll have to see how this develops over the coming months, it may be, to your point, that there is a particular area that wants to be an exemplar for a particular theme. And certainly I've had at least 2 conversations about environmental opportunities and the opportunity potentially for one or more places to actually champion that and to kind of lead the way. So we'll see whether or not that is something that follows through. But it is a discussion that's been brought to us from at least a couple of areas.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Thank you. So just looking a bit more broadly now, so the government's obviously consulting on changes to planning policy intended to accelerate house building at the moment. So Michael, what impact do you feel the wider reforms will have on the delivery of new towns, and are there any further reforms you would like to see to accelerate new towns delivery?
A pretty brief answer to that, really. I mean, we drew attention to the fact that government needs to look at whether there are any further changes to make to advance the programme of new towns. Everything I've heard is that they are absolutely on the case. So I'm confident, but let's see.
Okay, fair enough. Minister, the previous government decided to have the minimum accessibility standard for 100% of new homes under the Part 4.2. Can you explain why you've brought that down to 40%?
Some local areas that aren't delivering accessible housing in any volumes. What we proposed is 40% minimum on M423, but that is, and it was very clear in the extended oral statement I made on the subject, a minimum, and the areas are able to go beyond that, but we think that strikes the right balance between ensuring that every local area is delivering a certain proportion of affordable homes, but that we're maximising housing supply more widely at the same time.
Do you have an ambition of kind of where you would like that final number percentage to fall, given that's a minimum, but is there a sort of an ideal of where you'd
to encourage local authorities where they feel able to go beyond that minimum number? But we're currently out to consultation on that framework, and we'll listen to the feedback that we receive from it before making final decisions on that, on what the new MPPF will be.
And finally, if I may, just on behalf of one of my constituents, Maria G, who's very passionate about swift bricks, as I know many others are,
Indeed.
Could you just clarify where we're at on that policy, what Labour is doing to support swift bricks, and if you know roughly how many you expect to get in on your towns?
We've been very clear, and I fully appreciate that some people aren't happy with the fact that we have not taken the building regulations route. We did that for very good reason. I'm absolutely convinced that's actually a far slower route than what we've done. We've strengthened national policy expectations around swift bricks in particular, and we're very clear in the consultation. We believe that should mean at least one swift brick in every brick-built house, unless there are compelling reasons why that shouldn't be the case. We do need to account for the fact that there are some buildings, some development sites for which swift bricks, for example, would not be appropriate, but I think they'll be fairly small in number. This is a low cost, as you know, intervention that we could do. I listened actually, just as an aside, standing at the bar of the other place to an extensive debate on swift bricks. Experts in the other place would say that it's not the only necessary part of the solution to declining breeding swift numbers in the UK. Insect decline is another thing, but this is an important thing we can do through national policy to support.
Yeah, good to see that you're spending your time very wisely.
Indeed, I'm glad it.
Chris, very quickly.
Very quickly, we've just had what I think most people regard as an incredibly successful planning process, where over the course of a few months, your department has signed off on a incredibly substantial national, significant infrastructure projects with Universal in Bedford through an SDO process, which I don't think has been used for many other things before this, but has now probably proven that it is a quick and efficient way to do so. Is that something that you're looking at using for other things, particularly for new towns?
Not looking at using the SDO process to bring forward new towns. The SDO process has its place. What I was saying, Cathy could expand on this, it may look quick and efficient from the outside. It is incredibly resource intensive for the department to essentially become the planning authority. It was warranted in this case, and I think I agree we've got a really good outcome in terms of Universal coming into the UK, all the investment, jobs and opportunities that come with that. But it's not a mechanism that we can use regularly just because of the sheer amount of work and resource capacity it absorbs in the department. But it does have its place for certain schemes.
I agree.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, targets.
So yeah, just want to come on to affordable housing within the new towns world, if I may. And the task group were quite clear that affordable homes will help against that housing shortage. But we've seen some conflicting evidence around affordable housing. So the Town and Country Planners Association support it, but we've also heard in terms of the cost of infrastructure and low land prices on some of the new towns that actually being able to fund that affordable housing could be a challenge. So just a couple of quick questions to you, Minister, if I can. So in certain areas, would a rigid 40% minimum target be a risk to the government's wider house building ambitions? And then I'll ask the second question as well, and then you can cover them both off. And then will the government provide grant funding beyond existing levels to reach that 40% affordable housing where needed?
I think there's two things to say in response to that, Mr. Dillon. First is, in terms of the contribution that the New Towns programme will make to our wider house building targets, this allows me to touch on the issue of LHN and how we expect the new towns to interact with that. We've been very clear that our starting assumption was, not least because those new towns that were able to get up and running and being developed in this Parliament, back to Mr. Curtis's question, will only really start building out a volume in the later years of this Parliament and into the next, that our starting assumption was delivery of new towns would be over and above the targets that flow from our revised standard method. I've heard representations, members of the committee and others, to think again about the interaction of LHN in terms of ensuring the right incentives are in place. And we are giving that a lot of thought. What I'm determined to do, and we'll, again, apologies, but we'll publish the more detail on this as we take the scoping process forward. But what I'm absolutely determined to do to ensure there's a fair and consistent approach across the country, i.e. that we're not coming up with bespoke arrangements on LHN for every particular new site. I think we do need a fair and consistent approach, but we're giving consideration to how that interacts going forward. In terms of the 40%, it's an aspiration, it's an aim to deliver the 40% on each site, at least 20% which is social rented homes. That's really important to the government. And of course, and again, it goes back to the process that's underway in terms of looking at what is required for each individual site. Absolutely, one of the factors that we are considering is, through those government funding pots that I've described earlier, what might need to come forward to ensure we can deliver these sites in the way we can. So there will be a role for viability, and viability will bite on different sites in different ways. But we do want to ensure that that we're trying to meet that 40% wherever possible. It won't be the case, I can assure you, that any new town site comes forward with very low levels of affordable housing. But we've got to draw on, again, and look at where that 39 billion social and affordable housing programme in particular can support new towns delivery.
Can I just push you slightly on that aspiration number, and then also just maybe to Sir Michael. Your 12 recommendations would have considered the ability to deliver affordable housing within that remit. So then the question back to the Minister is, what would be the lowest percentage level that you would sign off for a new town to be acceptable? I mean, below 30% would be a no.
And I'm reluctant to sit here and sort of pluck a number out of the air. I'd like to get to at least 40% on all those sites. It's not that we can discount viability entirely, but again, that comes back to looking at the funding we have available, particularly in this Parliament, in the spending review, those grant funding pots as well as RDL funding pots we can draw on. What can we deliver on each site? But we've been very clear that our objective is that 40%. But we can't, I suppose what I'm saying is discount, and we've been very honest about that, I think I have in the previous session, discount viability entirely from as a consideration in taking the programme forward.
I mean, Sir Michael, did you have a comment at all about
I don't
that aspiration within the 12 that you've recommended?
To add, really, I mean, we were very clear that our view of these new town communities is that they are they're living communities, that they actually make space for all tenure types and all parts of the community, and recognising, of course, these things change over time. You know, the tenant of today is the owner of tomorrow in many cases. So,
in a functioning market.
Yeah, yes, absolutely, in a functioning market.
Thank you.
Thank you. Minister, when will the government set out its policy about the interaction of new towns and local authority housing targets?
So, Cathy can give some further insight, but at the point that we have gone through the consultation and issue our final report in response to the government task force, all the details about the programme will be known at that point, including how we intend to take forward that interaction between LHN and new towns. But I suppose I'm I'm sharing as much as I can with the committee as possible in making clear that we are giving careful consideration to how they interact, given that our starting point was these are over and above the LHN number. I've recognised that from incentive terms. Now, I don't think that means necessarily that local areas will be able to discount the entirety of their housing targets through a new town, but I think we want to ensure the right incentives are in place so that areas are, where they're generally otherwise supportive, that housing targets are not a factor that mean that they don't want to see these large-scale new communities come forward.
Thank you, Minister. And I think I understand your reasoning of why you've changed that approach. You're softening your approach. Has that been from feedback from local leaders that you had to reassure them? I suppose to Sir Michael, if the new towns were sort of imposed on local areas above their housing target, would you be concerned that there'd be opposition? Then your 12 projects wouldn't get off the ground.
What we reflected back in the report was that the issue had been raised with us on a number of occasions as we explored different locations, and I think the Minister said that he's taking that into consideration as he thinks about the future.
I'm entirely governed, I have to say, by what's fair to a local area in terms of this being a distinct delivery route. These are not just otherwise standard large sites, but what will ensure that there's the right balance of incentives that places want to bring them forward.
Thank you. Just looking at obviously engagement with local leaders, following on from that, Andrew.
Yes, thank you. I'm sure, Minister, you set out at the beginning that you want to take decisions at the best decision you can in the national interest, but I'm sure you would also want to, where possible, bring communities with you. I think it's fair to say that has not happened in Adlington in Cheshire East, where our colleague, the Honourable Member for Macclesfield, has presented a petition with over 19,000 signatures, I believe. Councillors on Cheshire East have been very critical at the extent to which they were consulted on this proposal before they started. I want to come to Sir Michael first. What consultation with local democratic leaders did the task force take before making its recommendations?
So, consistently, our focus was on who had brought forward the proposition. And that would be whether it's a council, as it was in the case of Milton Keynes, or a landowner or a developer. So we'd be responding to who it was who'd brought the proposition in. But as part of our exploration of the viability and of that, we will in every occasion have had a discussion with the local authority to learn about the local authority's perspective on this proposed development. If I just pick up Adlington in particular.
Please do.
In addition to this, when we came to prepare our report for government, we explicitly asked, in every case, the relevant local authority, were they content to be listed amongst those areas which we were recommending to government. In that case, Adlington responded by letter, signed by the leader and the deputy leader, saying they were. I think we felt that was safe enough at this stage for us to put the proposition forward to government for consideration. I mean, this is a fraught area, isn't it? Because actually we can name how many people have signed petitions, but what government has to balance, and what I think the task force would hope that they would balance, are the needs of those who are not yet residents, who are looking for homes, who are interested in the economic growth that we have in each of our 12 areas been able to identify. So it is fraught in how you get a view on the future interests as well as the current interests.
Okay, so Minister, as we move into the next stage of consultations, what can we learn from what's happened with the response to Adlington? How would you do community engagement differently so that we can hopefully bring people with us on the next round?
Well, I'm not sure the opposition that's been stated in respect of Adlington is a function of how we did community engagement, if I'm really honest. what we have done, and again this goes back to what the New Towns unit is doing, they are visiting local areas. They've made an offer to all political leaders to engage with them to further refine that evidence base around sites. We will, as I said many times to the committee, will carry out the appropriate assessments and public consultations before any final decisions are made on locations. But I do want to be really clear, and I couldn't have been more honest about this, we will make decisions on these locations in the national interest. We're not going to make decisions on these locations based on the number of signatories to a petition in opposition.
Indeed, although the developer in the Adlington case, Bellport Adlington I think it is, they've raised concerns, I think it's fair to say, about that the level of public engagement that they could do with the local community was limited by an NDA. Why was an NDA necessary, do you think?
Well, that was the standard process that we took across those sites which we were about to recommend to government. Not least because actually, until the point that we'd finished the report and handed it over, we weren't absolutely certain which ones were were going to be in the final choice set. So it was partly protecting those who'd put the ideas forward, but also giving the space to complete our work so that it could be recommended to government. I mean, I can concede that if there were a way, it would have been a good idea to consult more widely on all of those areas before we put them to government. But that would have required a very different timetable, and indeed would have required the Taskforce to become the proponent of the proposition, which, it seems to me dangerous ground, really. I mean, once government has made its decisions about which ones it wants to carry forward, that's a different matter. That's there's a clear locus there on which to consult.
I've got two colleagues indicating, Lewis and then Sean. Thank you.
Yeah, to the Minister and Sir Michael, when you go obviously through the local plan process, you have a duty to cooperate with your neighbouring authorities and what have you. I've asked written questions on this. There has been no consultation with neighbouring authorities in these proposed new towns. So when you move to the next stage of the consultation, can we get a cast iron guarantee that there is going to be consultation with neighbouring authorities? Because as I've said, the Chase Park Cruise Hill is just over the border, but it doesn't mean we're not going to see in Broxbourne serious ramifications from that development on our infrastructure, and we haven't yet once been consulted to give our views or ask questions about it.
I do with the task force, man.
Yeah, and I'll come in.
I mean, clearly, I acknowledge that that's the case. And I've already explained, we focused on those bringing the proposition forward.
So you focused on the people that's going to make the most money out of it and within their interest to get these sites forward. That's not a real sensible way to do it.
It's not the whole process either, is it? So we did concentrate on who'd brought the proposition to us. And our role is a limited role in recommending to government a series of potential locations which we feel were worthy of further experimentation to be taken forward. And we're quite clear in our report about the importance of further consultation. So I think our approach was the right one, to limit the number of people engaged, to work to the timescale, which was very tight, and to then deliver to government the suggestion, this might be an area to look at. You need to consult extensively and indeed to take on board cross-border issues. I don't think it was for us to resolve all those issues.
Just before the Minister comes in, can I just clarify then? So you're saying if you'd have had more time, you would have done more in-depth consultation on these sites?
I'm saying that we were working and focused on completing the work to the timescale that we'd agreed to.
So you were.
So I'm not saying, I can't tell you what we'd have done if we'd have had more time, and exactly how that time would have been allocated across the range of things that we were trying to advise on.
Just on that point, I've spent time at Cruise Hill and have met with the local authority and know the site fairly well. It will be subject to the normal planning process if it is chosen in the final decisions that ministers bring forward. So yes, duty to cooperate will be appropriate. We're not trying to circumvent the planning process through these initial discussions. And everything I've discussed with the local authority there is a commitment to engage with local communities, and you know, the normal planning process will apply.
All that I would add, Chair, is, and I appreciate Mr. Cocking the frustration, but I think the issue here is that your question is almost premised on us being at the end of the process rather than midway through it. The role of the task force was to come up with recommendations around the sites. It's now for government to refine the scope of the programme and to consult on it. And that consultation will allow a wider group of authorities and other interested parties to make comments on the programme as a whole and those locations. And then you've got the process, Mr. Curtis's chagrin, but of if delivery vehicles of a specific kind come forward to be consulting on issues like the precise red line boundary of a development corporation or whatever it might be. So there will be time to take that into account. Just quickly on local plans. We expect local planning authorities to continue development of their local plans. We'll work with local areas to ensure that those plans support growth that's envisaged in Newtown propositions. There are other changes to the duty to cooperate that we've announced as part of the new plan making system that I'm sure you're aware of, but I'm happy to get into that.
I'm mindful that you've got to leave, Minister. We've just got one final comment from
It's
Sean.
just one point of clarification for Sir Michael, if I may. You stated that, rightly, you focused on those who put forward the sites, but that you did contact, on the list of 12, the local authorities to say, do you have any problem with this going forward? Can I take from that no local authorities of that 12 objected to theirs being on the list?
Yes, they wouldn't have been put forward if we'd actually had a serious rejection of the idea.
So all the local authorities, where the sites are, said we're happy for this to be put forward?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Chris, last.
A very quick clarification as well. You said the normal planning process will apply. Now, if the normal planning process applies, that means local councils being able to sign off and veto effectively Newtown programmes that have been put forward by the national government. So surely there is going to have to be some mechanism.
I think it depends what it depends entirely on the delivery vehicle, doesn't it? If it's a mayoral development corporation, that will have a particular planning process. If it's a centrally led one, it will have a particular process. A public-private partnership, a joint venture, would go down in a sense the standard. I think what Cathy's just trying to say is there'll be a process that comes forward with any particular delivery vehicle in addition to the work the government's doing and indeed the task force did.
Thank you very much, Cathy, Minister and Sir Michael.
Pleasure.
Thank you. We will continue to engage with you as this progresses following the SCA consultation later in the spring.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you.